A controversial new book, Sunset of Arms, attacks British involvement in the Korean campaign of the 1950s as pointless, wasteful, and last-gasp imperialism. Written by Harold Pusey, professional historian and head of the history department at Crombie University, the book has attracted much criticism and is now the centre of a sensational libel action. Major Alistair Fitton, sole survivor of the defence of the post that came to be known as Hill 329 during the retreat from Manchuria, is suing Pusey and the publishers of Sunset of Arms for libel. Pusey suggests that as the situation worsened and eventually became hopeless on Hill 329, Major Fitton lost his nerve and abandoned his wounded and dying men, choosing to save his own life rather than share their fate. A company director these days, Major Fitton asserts that the allegations are utterly false and highly damaging. In the Crown Court this afternoon, Major Fitton is represented by Mr. Andrew Logan, QC, and Miss Helen Tate, and Jonathan Fry, QC, appears for Harold Pusey.
Last members of the jury, I will show that my client, Harold Pusey, had every justification for the statement he made about Major Alistair Fitton in his book, Sunset of Arms. In other words, the defence will be that the words written by Professor Pusey about the plaintiff, Major Fitton, were true. And now, with your Lordship's permission, I propose for the jury's benefit to read once again the passage containing the alleged libel. It occurs, your Lordship will recall, on page 103 of the hardback edition. The author is speaking in general terms of the deficiencies of the British staff work during the Korean campaign. The Hill 329 affair stands out as a characteristic piece of blimpish folly. For sheer bumbling inadequacy, it is probably unmatched in military annals, unless by the tragic history of the Light Brigade. The officer in charge, Major Alistair Fitton, left with barely 40 men after the disorganized retreat from the Manchurian border, was ordered to fight a rearguard action from Hill 329 until further notice. Typically, further notice never came. Thus, everybody died on Hill 329, with the exception of Major Fitton himself, who seems to have realized at length that he was the victim of a suicidally inept administration and made sensible arrangements to survive personally, whatever the fate of his companions and men. I call, first of all, the defendant, Harold Pusey.
What is your religion?
Roman Catholic.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on this card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Harold Pusey. You are Professor of History at Crombie University and author of the book Sunset of Arms.
I am.
Professor, you've just heard a passage from that book read out in court, referring inter alia to Major Alistair Fitton and certain alleged behaviour of his at Hill 329 in the Korean campaign. Do you accept responsibility for those words?
Yes, I wrote it.
What are your qualifications as a military historian?
Well, it is my particular field. I've published a number of works on the major campaigns of World War II. I edited the pictorial publication The Fall of Japan, and I was consultant on the television series Burma Road.
You have, in fact, paid particular attention to the military history of the Far East.
Yes, I have.
Have you ever been involved in official war history?
Well, I contributed to the official history of the Burma campaign. I was also once asked to do a piece for a symposium on Korea, but I refused.
Why was that?
Because I knew that my appreciation of the British part in that campaign would be unacceptable to Whitehall. It would have been a waste of time.
But surely, Professor, the writing of history is simply the setting down of the known facts.
I entirely agree.
Would you at all events regard yourself as qualified to speak about the retreat from the Manchurian border in December 1950?
Well, I should hope so. It was precisely that aspect that the learned symposium makers suggested I dealt with.
Thank you. If the usher would now be kind enough to set up the map. My Lord, this is an agreed map.
Yes. No doubt if Professor Pusey is going to refer to the map, it might make it easier for him if you were to leave the witness box.
Oh, I'm most obliged to your Lordship. Professor, if you'd care to come down here, I think you'd find it easier. Would you first of all give us the general background to the retreat?
Yes, certainly. By November 1950, the United Nations forces had advanced to roughly here. Now, this had been a splendid gain of territory, driving the North Koreans clear across the border into Manchuria. But, and typically, I'm afraid, it had been made with such speed and what can only be described as daring do, that no proper reconnaissance of this country had been made, and very little thought had been given to the approaching winter either. Consequently, the enemy, well used to the terrain, and of course knowing how to survive in it, had a really tremendous advantage. Now, the Chinese came into the war and made an irresistible thrust southwards. The Americans, being mobilized, swiftly withdrew from Pakchon here, and at Tokchon here the Turkish brigade fought a very noble last stand, but of course were quite unable to hold the position. Most other national groups made arrangements to fall back, but the British and the Australians, for reasons best known to their commanders, or perhaps, after all, only to their creator himself, decided to fight a series of rearguard actions. Now, readers of my book will know that this is one of my principal criticisms of the British effort in the Korean campaign, the rearguard action. Intended to slow down an advancing enemy, it became an old standby of British military strategy. I've no doubt it was highly useful as a tactic in the Crimea, or even as late as the Boer War, but its relevance in modern mechanized warfare. Anyway, the Americans raced away and lived to fight another day, but our troops became involved in a series of the most bloody rearguard actions, holding actions, and not one of which has ever proved its value, since the United Nations line inevitably fell back beyond the 38th parallel. Anyway...
Was Hill 329 one such bloody holding action?
Yes, indeed. Hill 329 was. The official orders simply said, stand until further notice. To what practical end, it's very hard to say.
Would you indicate for us the geographical position of Hill 329?
Yes, indeed, here on the northern shores of the Taedong River.
And what were the circumstances of the defence of this hill?
Well, of course, the southern slopes of Hill 329 did offer a smooth, sheltered access to the river. It seems to have been supposed by the relevant command that the Chinese might make an armoured crossing at that point.
However, the Chinese forces attacked the position quite savagely.
Yes, once they'd found it being defended, a vicious circle.
Now, the officer commanding the defence of this hill was, in fact, Major Alistair Fitton, was it not?
Yes. Major Fitton had been engaged with infantry some 50 miles to the northwest, guarding a section of the Chongchon Railroad. Told to withdraw by brigade, he was then told to occupy Hill 329 and commence action with, I quote, such men as he had available.
Such men as he had available, these being in number no more than 40, of whom some 12 were wounded.
Yes.
An impossible situation, Professor.
Oh, yes. Quite typical.
Now, is there any indication in the records that Major Fitton resented his orders, or that he at any time sought to be relieved of them?
These records are agreed, are they?
Oh, they are. They are among the agreed documents, my lord, yes. Is there any indication, Professor, that the Major sought to be relieved of his orders?
Well, his RT operator, one Corporal Batley, contacted brigade repeatedly throughout the three-day period of the defence, asking for support of almost any kind that was available. Some American tank reserves were sent in on day 2, but in the event they didn't help very much. Then an airstrike was promised, but before it could be organised, we are told that communications with the brigade were destroyed, and shortly after that, the defence of Hill 329 effectively came to an end.
We are told.
In records. Records also tell us that Major Fitton, some 24 hours after this cessation of communications, Major Fitton was picked up by an ambulance patrol on the northern shores of the Taedong River, the sole survivor of the operation. Apparently, he'd been trying to get his remaining wounded across to the other side, assisted by Corporal Batley, who it seems was the last man to fall. However, a final Chinese artillery attack vanquished even this pious ambition.
An impartial observer might at this point detect a certain irony in your tone, Professor.
Then the impartial observer would be quite right. It's my conviction that in the matter of Hill 329, the official record is a pack of calculated lies.
That's A very strong statement to make, Professor.
I shall be able to support it. I'd like to see the model, please, the one dealing with the topography of Hill 329. Thank you. Now, do remember that I'm controverting the official documents. It is because, in fact, my researches have led me to subsidiary records that I am able to make these charges. Now, we are told, I repeat, that communications on Hill 329 here were destroyed by a final Chinese artillery attack from emplacements around here. However, the 22nd Canadians who moved in on a mopping-up mission after an airstrike had in turn got rid of the Chinese occupiers report nothing like this at all. On the contrary, they tell us explicitly that the RT was still in working order. Again, the official record tells us that Major Fitton was picked up by the ambulance patrol on the northern shores of the Taidong River whilst trying to get his remaining wounded across, arguably, about here. However, the 22nd Canadians, who achieved an almost complete body count, mind you, tell us nothing about dead discovered down here, or indeed anywhere else, except on the high slopes of Hill 329. And finally, Major Fitton, a sole survivor after Batley fell, is supposed to be picked up by the ambulance men on the northern shores of the Taidong River. However, evidence has since come to light that tells us that before he was, in actual fact, picked up in this way, he was encountered by an Australian platoon here, on the south side of the Taidong River, some 500 yards from the water.
I see. Was this before the cessation of activities on Hill 329 or after?
As far as can be discerned, before. Now, these are just facts, that's all I'm trying to say. We historians don't try to impugn people, living or dead. We just try to establish the facts and come to terms with them. That's all.
We are thus referred to the bundle of agreed documents, Mr. Fry.
That is so, my lord. You'll find there the official record of events at Hill 329, together with two separate extracts from the records of the 22nd Canadians, and another document supplied by an Australian patrol, but evidence on that matter is to be called here.
Yes, my lord, we'll agree these documents.
Thank you.
Well, Professor Pusey, you're highly critical of the British effort in Korea, aren't you?
Well, I should have thought that was pretty obvious by now.
Yes, but perhaps not for reasons you've made altogether clear to us. Not if your recent book is anything to go by, that is. You believe that the Korean War was, more than anything else, an American effort, don't you?
Well, so it was. It's ridiculous to think of it in any other way, despite that rather bland United Nations label. The USA contributed far and away the lion's share of both men and material. It's only a pity that the American grand strategy, which in its way wasn't all that foul, should have been time and time again frustrated and confused by the independent operations of tin-pot little armies.
Tin-pot little armies, like the British?
Yes, fighting stupid little rearguard actions like Hill 329.
Hill 329. Yes, of course, Professor Pusey. I must say that you're extremely well informed about Hill 329.
I'm an historian. I made a study of the incident.
Again, not if your recent book is anything to go by.
I beg your pardon?
Well, in your recent book, Professor, do you give a great deal of space to the incident of Hill 329?
Not a great deal, no, but...
Hardly more than the paragraph that has led to this action here today, in fact.
No, however...
Whereas in evidence just now, you proved to be a positive mine of information, didn't you? The official record, a pack of lies, contrary reports from the Canadians and the Australians. Why on earth didn't you include all this in your book?
Why?
It makes stimulating copy, don't you think?
A squalid little scandal. One doesn't muckrake, you know.
A squalid little scandal suggesting that a regimental officer had shown gross cowardice in the battle line and deserted his wounded to save his own skin.
Yes.
Oh, come, Professor Pusey. A dedicated establishment knocker like you passing up a golden opportunity like that?
Lord, I do object to these prejudicial
Yes, Mr. Logan, please don't make those sort of comments. If you wish to prove that he has that sort of reputation, ask him. Besides, I'm not at all sure that the term establishment knocker occurs in the dictionary.
Well, failing the Oxford English Dictionary, my lord, one instinctively turns to your lordship for usage. Why didn't you make much of this knowledge of yours, Professor?
Because I didn't choose to. An author has some rights over his own material,
But
surely.
was it perhaps because you felt you couldn't prove what you would say?
Nonsense. The relevant documents are here, introduced in evidence. They prove it.
Prove everything?
What?
Well, there are facts. And there are inferences, Professor. Now, you suggest that Major Fitton left his post.
Well, so he did. Whatever his reasons, you can't controvert that.
Leaving his wounded to die?
I didn't quite put it in that way. In my book, I simply said that he plainly left them, whatever their fate. Well, he certainly wasn't trying to get them across the river, as the official record states, anyway.
But how do you know that for certain?
Because no dead were found by the riverside.
What was the count of dead, Professor Pusey? Can you tell us? There were some missing, I believe.
Very few, 3 at the most.
And at this point, Corporal Batley would have been the only man fit enough to assist Major Fitton in transporting the wounded, would he not?
Arguably.
So 1 or 2 bodies at the riverside would be all that you'd expect to find anyway. Now, isn't it possible that the attack blew these unfortunates and Batley into the river so that the cadavers were carried away?
If anything like that had happened, surely Major Fitton would have contacted Brigade, explaining he was unable to carry on with the action.
Yes, but his radio telephone was out of order.
The 22nd Canadians tell us not.
But supposing that Major Fitton thought it to be out of order.
Really
But
must.
isn't that possible? I mean, at least as possible as that a British officer of otherwise irreproachable character should callously leave to their fate wounded and dying men. You've no lost love for the British Army and its personnel, have you, Professor Pusey?
Because of its methods and outlook. We aren't guarding the Khyber Pass, you know. It's a long time since a platoon of British soldiers instilled fear into the hearts of craven foreigners.
Yes, we've declined into our sunset of arms, so to speak.
If you wish.
You've served in the forces yourself, Professor, have you?
No. As it happens, I was too young for World War II, and later I was excused national service because of my studies.
And so your knowledge of the British military character, then, is purely academic?
A Tudor historian doesn't actually have to have met Henry VIII, you know.
But do you understand the British soldier, Professor?
I should hope so.
The British regimental officer? You see, in your recent book, speaking of Major Fitton's alleged desertion of his post, you say that he made sensible arrangements to survive personally. Now, do you really account that the reaction of a trained officer of the line?
That was merely a colourful way of saying he left the battle area. Sensible arrangements. Well, after all, he had been given absurd orders.
But what would have been his reaction to those orders, absurd or not? The reaction of a trained British officer. To disregard them and run away, do you seriously imagine that?
There are anomalies in the official record. Questions to be asked.
Oh, quite. Beyond doubt. But won't you agree, Professor, that your researches have unearthed these anomalies whilst utterly failing to answer the questions? Except, that is, in terms of an alarming and rather unlikely character lapse in Major Fitton.
No. Major Fitton must bear the ultimate responsibility for whatever happened on Hill 329. Who else?
Whatever happened. Now, there's an interesting change of emphasis. So there could be various interpretations, then.
I didn't mean that. I simply implied that Major Fitton and his behaviour occupy the centre of the stage, so to speak, and can't easily be edged out of the limelight.
So you still insist a British officer funked his orders, abandoned his wounded and dying men, and finally falsified the official record so that he himself might come out of the whole incident with credit?
I said nothing about falsifying the record.
Yes, something of that sort must have happened, mustn't it, Professor Pusey? How else does it come to tell the precise story that it does?
I don't know. These things aren't my business.
More anomalies, then. More questions to be asked. Well, someone will really have to get down to some comprehensive answers pretty soon, won't they, Professor? Thank you.
Professor, at the time you wrote your book, Sunset of Arms, were you aware of the conflict between the official record in the matter of Hill 329 and what the Australians, Canadians, and so on had to say?
Yes, I was.
Then was there perhaps a reason you've not yet fully explained to the court for suppressing this material in your published texts?
Yes, to be perfectly frank, I wanted to cause as little pain as possible. Well, it's my duty as an historian to tell the truth. I didn't want in any sense to single out Major Fitton. I don't blame him for leaving his post. As it happens, he was in an impossible position. Anyone might have done the same thing.
And this was why you chose not to be more precise about what happened at Hill 329.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor. That would be all.
You can stand down, Professor Pusey.
I call Morton Xavier Lass.
Morton Lass. What is your religion?
Methodist.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Morton Xavier Lass, and you live at 1257 North Vista Towers, Chicago, Illinois.
That's correct, yes.
What is your occupation, Mr. Lass?
I'm in the meatpacking business, Eastern Division.
Have you ever met the plaintiff in this action, Major Alistair Fitton?
Yes, sir, I have. I first met Major Fitton close on to 20 years ago during the Korean campaign. I was a tank commander. I was sent up to help him in the defense he was making of a hill emplacement.
Was this the emplacement that is now known as Hill 329?
It was, that's correct.
Well, perhaps you could summarize the circumstances for us.
Well, Major Fitton was having a pretty rough time by all accounts. He was fighting a rearguard action on Hill 329, being pounded like crazy. A single day he lost something like 15 men, which is pretty solid.
And that's 15 out of an original 40, some 12 of whom were wounded anyway.
That's what they tell me.
And you were sent up to help.
With 4 Shermans, yes.
And in the event, were you able to be of great assistance to Major Fitton?
No, sir. You see, the trouble with tanks in terrain like that is their flat trajectory. Now, by that I mean you can't get elevation to firepower. Hill 329 was in pretty mountainous terrain, so as soon as we moved in with the Shermans, the Chinese just occupied higher positions. I don't think we had a chance to knock a single enemy gun out of action.
And what was Major Fitton's reaction to this?
Major Fitton's reaction. He blew his mind.
Blew his mind?
Yes, sir, I never saw a man go so far over the edge so fast. He yelled at me, where were the ambulance patrols to get his wounded out? Where were the reinforcements, the supplies? I just had to say, sorry, that had nothing to do with me, and perhaps me and my tanks had better find the war someplace else if we couldn't be of any use to him.
You're saying that Major Fitton was showing signs of strain on day 2 of Hill 329, then?
You kidding? He was operating out of a foxhole halfway down the southern slope where his RT was housed, popping in and out of there like a jackrabbit, swearing at some kind of sergeant in there to keep putting pressure on brigade.
Corporal, I believe. Corporal Backley.
Corporal, yes, yes. Well, then he'd deploy his troops to different positions along the ridge, but every time there was mortar fire, he'd go to ground himself.
You mean that Major Fitton was deliberately staying out of the line of fire?
Look, it was just one hell of a circus on Hill 329. Fitton was in a bad spot. It would have been difficult enough to have held that position with a company that low.
Stick to the facts, please. On Hill 329, did you have any reason to believe that Major Fitton, whilst exposing his men to danger, was taking pains to keep out of trouble himself?
Well, it wasn't so much the way he acted, maybe, as something he said.
Something he said?
A shell landed about, only 50 yards from us. Killed a guy. When the dirt settled, I thought I heard Fitton. It was a sound like dry sobbing. Then he looked up to me, and suddenly he said, he suddenly said, was there some way that I could get him out of there in the tanks with me, because he'd just made up his mind he was not sticking around to get killed for nothing.
The case of Fitton versus Pusey will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.